Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to class number 2. The title of this class is Fictional and Procedural Space, and that's a topic that we're going to talk about for the next, I think, 2 or 3 weeks. All right, so just to remind you from last week, the way that we do this class, either when we're teaching remotely or teaching in person, will be like this. I will always make some pre-recorded lectures, especially in the weeks when we have some new theoretical topics to look at, and I'll upload these lectures a few days before class so that you can watch them before class and we can have discussions based on some of the themes in the lecture. Then I will always make some pre-recorded tutorials, especially for the work that we're doing in Blender. So every week when we discuss new ideas, we will connect these ideas to some new techniques in Blender, and hopefully over these first 8 to 10 weeks in particular, we'll really build up your abilities in that software and give you some new tools to make your components for your creative artworks. And on Tuesdays, every morning on 9:30 a.m. Tuesdays, we will go till usually 12:30, sometimes 1:30, and we will use a combination of Zoom for live lectures and discussions. Blender is the software that we'll be using, so have that loaded on your computer, hopefully with a computer mouse, makes life a lot easier. We'll also use real-time whiteboards on Miro, and we'll do a lot of work in Google Drive, writing down our ideas and workshopping things together. Okay, so for class this week, what we're going to do is we're going to have a show and tell. I'd like to see what you made in your first Blender tutorials. Now, because that was week 1, I don't expect everybody to have finished these works. I just hope that you've made something that we can have a look at. And what I'd like to do then is make a list of the problems we encountered. What was the most difficult part of the exercise? Did anybody get stuck in the software somewhere? And if you did get stuck and found a way to get unstuck or solve your problem, how did you do it? And this will be a great thing to discuss together so that we can help share. Some of us pick things up quickly, for some of us it's a bit more slow, but if we can share how we do it, I think we'll all benefit from it. And we'll write this down in Google Drive. Then we're going to have a class discussion on the subject of this lecture, which is procedural space. So we'll have another Google Drive document open. We'll see if we can list what the key themes in the lecture are. I'll give you some time to find some inspirational images for buildings that use a sort of procedural repetition in the way that they work. If you look out your window, you'll see that most buildings are, very repetitive in this way. And then we're going to use some of these inspiration images for our own Blender exercise. And then, of course, I'll allow you some more time to continue to work on the Blender exercises we started in week 1, which connected to the online tutorials. And I'll introduce a new tutorial where we start to do some introductory 3D modeling on the theme of procedural towers and cities. Okay, so the topic for the theory lecture this week is fiction and procedural space. So when we say procedural modeling, we're talking about the use of often simple rules to generate very complex forms. These rules might be repetition, rotation, if you want to Google terms like fractal patterns and so on. Basically, the wonderful thing about a computer is that a computer can take a simple rule and repeat it many, many, many times so that we can have works of quite beautiful complexity made with a minimum amount of manual effort. Okay, and so the way that I'm going to introduce this topic today is with a story. It's going to be a story about a tower, like this image here. Next week, I'm going to tell you a different story, which will be a story about a library. But both of these stories are, in many ways, the same story. And both of them use space in a procedural manner. So, The story that I've read for this week and that I've also uploaded to our Moodle and Google Drive is The Tower of Babylon, which is a short story by the science fiction writer Ted Chiang. The setting for this story is the mythological Tower of Babylon, which comes from a mythological story from the Christian Bible in the book of Genesis. In this story, the Tower of Babel or the Tower of Babylon, all of humanity speaks a single language. There are no different languages, and therefore the human race is able to communicate and able to collaborate. And this allows them to work on great projects together. And they decide, I guess, to embark on the greatest project they could imagine, which is to build a tower tall enough to reach the heavens so that they can speak directly with God. So from the book of Genesis, I'll read out how the story is described. And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And they said to one another, "Go to, let us make brick and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone, and slime had they for mortar. And they said, "Go to, let us build a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of men had builded. And the Lord said, "Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language. And this they begin to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. Go to, let us go down there and confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech." So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of the earth, and they left off to build the city. Therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth. And thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of the earth. Okay, so in the story, when God sees the tower reaching up towards the heavens and humans wanting to speak on the same level as God, God takes away the common language from humanity and scatters humans all over the world, in a sense so that humans cannot collectively reach the same level as God or the same level as the divine. This is the main sort of conflict in this story found in the book of Genesis. And so many modern scholars, in an architectural sense, have compared how the Tower of Babel is described to archaeological sites such as the ziggurat of Etemenanke and many other myths from other cultures around the world, including Sumeria, Mexico, Arizona, and Nepal, which all contain many references to building towers up to the gods and then the supernatural destruction of these towers or their builders as a sort of punishment. Much like the images of the Tower of Babylon that we find throughout Christian art history and popular culture, there's a very procedural quality even to how structures like ziggurats work, when we see repetitions and variations in scale. Often we simply have a cube that progressively gets higher and at the same time gets smaller. But in this repetition, we get these quite beautiful complex shapes. And on the left-hand side, here's an image from the contemporary artist Yang Yongliang. And on the right-hand side, we have a work by Japanese architectural illustration from Minoru Nomata. And in both cases, we can see the sort of the link to particularly the very famous works by Peter Bruegel that I was showing you before, like here. Okay, so in the case of Ted Chiang's more recent story, The Tower of Babylon, which I hope some of you will read it before class, and if you haven't read it, I recommend pausing the video and reading it. It's a, it's not a particularly long story. It might take you an hour or maybe 2 hours to read, but it's very enjoyable. Instead of watching a movie, maybe try reading this story. I think it's a great one. And so here's how Ted Chiang describes his inspiration for writing this story. He says, the story was inspired by a conversation with a friend. And the friend mentioned the version of the Tower of Babel myth that he'd been taught in Hebrew school. And he says, at that point, I only knew the account in the Old Testament, which is the one that I read before, and it hadn't made a big impression. But in the more elaborate version that his friend was taught in Hebrew school, the tower is so tall that it takes a year to climb. And when someone falls to their death, no one mourns, but when a brick is dropped, the bricklayers will cry because it takes a year to replace a single brick. The original legend is about the consequences of defying God. For Chiang, the tale also conjured up images of a fantastic city in the sky, reminiscent of René Magritte's Castle in the Pyrenees. And Ted Chiang was captivated by the audacity of such a vision and started wondering what life in such a city in the sky would be like. His friend Tom Dish called the story Babylonian science fiction. Ted Chiang said he hadn't thought about it that way when he was writing it. The Babylonians certainly knew enough physics and astronomy to recognize that this story was fanciful and fictional, but he gets the point. The characters in the story are religious, but really the religion of the characters in the story is to do with engineering more than it is to do with prayer. And in Ted Chiang's story, God never makes an appearance. The story is really about the mechanical and architectural nature of the universe in which the Tower of Babylon might have existed. So I'll give you a brief summary. In Ted Chiang's story, we follow the journey of a miner called Hilalum, and this miner is slowly climbing to the top of the tower. We learn that the builders of the tower have called out far and wide across the lands now for miners instead of builders, so people who dig holes instead of who build towers, because they think that as the tower gets closer to the sky, they will reach a giant stone ceiling which separates the mortal realm from the heavens. Over the weeks and months that Hilalum climbs the tower, we learn about the tower's repetitive structure, how every level is quite similar but getting a tiny bit smaller every time. And we also learn about the strange universe that Ted Chiang has set his tower in. When Hilalum starts climbing the tower, it sounds familiar, it sounds like something that could have existed in ancient Mesopotamia. But the higher he gets, he starts to climb up past the moon and then eventually up past the stars. And we start to realize that this is quite a strange and different type of universe than the one that we live in. And also, as Hilalum climbs up, he encounters different social structures and completely different cultures at different levels of the tower. So the story really becomes about the relationship between the tower and the structure of the universe and how human society exists somewhere in between. Now, if you haven't read this story yet, but you want to, I definitely recommend stopping the video here or skipping this slide, because I'm going to tell you partly how the story ends. Okay, so when Hilalum and his companions reach the top of the tower, there is indeed a stone ceiling that marks the boundary between the universe and the heavens. The miners use very clever techniques to dig up and then dig sideways to build tunnels that zigzag up. But also, from their mythology, they believe that on top of the stone is a vast ocean. And so they're scared that when they reach the top, there will be a flood. So they build lots of interesting spaces to hold the water and trap the water and so on. And finally, when they do break through the top of the stone ceiling, there is indeed a flood, and Hilalum gets stuck, he gets thrown around by water, he thinks he's going to drown, and eventually he reaches the surface of the water and he sees a strange land all around him. And he realizes that he must have made it to heaven. And eventually he sees a man walking past. And he asks the man, "Where am I?" And the man says, "Oh, you're near a village that is the building site of the famous Tower of Babylon." And so what Hilalum discovers is that he, having gotten up to the top of the tower and broken through the ceiling of heaven, he has actually ended up back where he started. He's broken through the earth, and the top is actually also the bottom. So this is sort of the surprise ending of the type of universe that Ted Chiang creates for us. And we can see how, if this story is about the pursuit of human knowledge or human technology, Ted Chiang makes a sort of an interesting twist where human beings sort of end up back where they started. So this kind of universe structure that Ted Chiang described is quite interesting. And at the end of the story, Hilalum is trying to understand what is the shape of the world that could explain how he ended up back where he started. And I've highlighted this section. It's quite interesting. It says, "And then it came to him," to Hilalum, "a seal cylinder. When rolled upon a tablet of soft clay, these carved cylinders leave an imprint that makes a picture. Two figures might appear at opposite ends of the tablet, even though on the cylinder they stood side by side. All of the world is a cylinder. Men imagine heaven and earth as being at different ends of the stone tablet, with the sky and the stars stretched between. But the world is actually wrapped in some fantastic way so that heaven and earth touched. It was clear now why Yahweh, or God, had not struck down the tower, as we find in the story of Genesis, had not punished men for wishing to reach beyond the bounds that had been set for them. For the longest journey would merely return them to the place whence they'd come. Centuries of labour would not reveal to them any more of creation than they already knew. Yet through their endeavour, men would glimpse the unimaginable artistry of Yahweh's work, in seeing how ingenious the world had been constructed. By this construction, Yahweh's work was indicated, and Yahweh's work was concealed." I'm just going to have a sip of tea so that my throat doesn't get too dry. Just a moment. Okay, so technically, this story by Ted Chiang is what we call an etiology. It's a story that it's a mythological story that tries to explain, the shape of the world that we live in. And this is a very common function in mythological stories that try to give a spatial explanation for the world around us. And the sort of model of the universe that Ted Chiang is looking at, whether it's this seal cylinder shape or these sort of layered spheres shapes. These images come from some science fiction forums where people are discussing Ted Chiang's story. They're all quite consistent with many of the models of the universe that were popular with Mesopotamian and Hebrew mythologies. And on the one hand, the general idea of the human relationship with technology as some sort of challenge to divine law is a very popular theme in many types of classical mythologies. For example, in Greek mythology, the Titan Prometheus steals fire from the gods and gives it to humans, which is a symbol for the invention of technology for humans, and humans all of a sudden developing a very different relationship to the world that the other animals enjoy. And we see this in popular films all the time. On the upper left-hand corner, we have an image from Ridley Scott's film Prometheus. And on the right-hand side, we have the xenomorph alien, also from the same film franchise. And on the bottom left-hand image, we have Prometheus stealing the fire for humanity. And if we follow this kind of metaphor a little bit further between, spatial architecture, technology, and our relationship to nature or to God, we should also look at maybe one of the most popular retellings of the Prometheus story, which is Mary Shelley's Gothic horror novel, Frankenstein, the Modern Prometheus. The full title of the book is Frankenstein, the Modern Prometheus. And in this book, Mary Shelley tells the story of Dr. Victor Frankenstein, who is a brilliant scientist who tries to create artificial life. And in the story, Dr. Frankenstein succeeds, and he creates artificial life using body parts that he digs up from a graveyard. But after he succeeds, he is immediately terrified and disgusted by the monster that he creates, and he abandons the monster. The monster that Dr. Frankenstein abandons ends up escaping his laboratory and lives by himself alone and scared in the wilderness. In the story, the monster then returns and frightens Dr. Frankenstein and demands that in exchange for not killing Dr. Frankenstein, he wants Dr. Frankenstein to make the monster a wife. A second monster that he can love, so that he's no longer alone. And if Dr. Frankenstein refuses, the monster says not only will he kill him, but he will kill all the people that Dr. Frankenstein loves to make him also alone. So in Mary Shelley's story, the monster of Dr. Frankenstein combines this Promethean warning about human beings having to be responsible for the technologies they create with a kind of biblical creation story where Victor Frankenstein, a little bit like the God in the Old Testament, struggles to accept the freedom and the responsibility for the beings that he has created. Much like in the Tower of Babel, when the humans build the tower up to the sky, God realizes that the humans could indeed challenge the power relationship between God and his creation, and so therefore he destroys the ability of the humans to talk to one another. And in the Frankenstein story, we have a similar sort of struggle with Dr. Frankenstein, where having succeeded in creating artificial life, he is disgusted by it, and he tortures it by leaving the monster alone, and therefore creating a cycle where the monster therefore wants to take revenge on Dr. Frankenstein for treating him so badly. So returning back now to the Tower of Babylon, we can see that architecture in this story, instead of medical science in the Frankenstein story, in the Tower of Babylon story, it's architecture that is used as the metaphor for human ambition. And it's the common language, which is the technology that fuels or that allows people to work together on a single creative act. To take the analysis a little further, in the 1999 essay, The Whole of Babel, Magic Geographies of the Global, German artist and essayist Hito Sterl explores how the Tower of Babel myth can be used to explain contemporary tensions between different populations today, such as different language groups and different cultural groups. In his 1917 short story, The Great Wall of China, the famous Bohemian novelist Franz Kafka explores how the Great Wall of China, whilst never really working as a defensive structure against northern invaders, it functioned a lot like a Tower of Babel, in that it was a construction project of such a huge scale that it created a sense of national unity within those who built it. And symbolically, we could argue that the Great Wall of China has a similar function today, as do large projects and large monuments in many countries. And for Hito Sterl, in her Whole of Babel essay, she's really interested in the concept of complete and incomplete walls and how they can either unify or divide populations. So for Hito Sterl, the fragmentation and eventual destruction of the Berlin Wall meant that the people of East and West Germany could no longer use one another as a convenient group to be afraid of or to blame for their problems, what we call a universal other. By removing the wall, this convenient conceptual separation also disappeared. And the position of the universal other, for those of you who are interested, is theorized by Edward Said in his 1978 book Orientalism. And the universal other usually refers to the European projection of difference onto people from North Africa, the Middle East, or Asia. In Hito Sterl's analysis, she argues that the desire to either transform another group of people into a universal other, to idolize them, to fear them, to blame them, or to ridicule them, is actually intimately connected to the opposite desire, the desire for the universality of the common language, of the common life condition. And this is the paradox that we have in the original Tower of Babel myth. From the perspective today, I guess, of modern digital communications, our devices, our smartphones, can translate instantly almost any language, and digital networks in many ways seem almost universal. And many of us now are the children of people who have left their original homelands generations ago, as is my case, being from Australia. And all of my ancestors, of course, are not from Australia. They're from many different parts of the world. But the thing that strangely unifies a lot of us today is our relationship to modern networks. And so one other question that we can sort of take from Hito Sterl's essay is, do we therefore all collectively become the universal outsider, or are we in a distributed form of a Tower of Babel technological relation? And some of these questions of whether these technologies might bring us together or push us apart are the subject of well-known books like this one here, Alone Together by Sherry Turkle. Okay, so a final quote from Hito Sterl. She writes, "From an elevated perspective, a new evaluation of the disaster of Babel followed suit." What she means is a new way of looking at the destruction of the tower. When the tower was destroyed, everyone seemed to be equally alienated and uprooted. Everyone seemed to share a common basis. At least this is the general picture obtained from the upper floors of the new Babylonian construction. From an elevated angle, a perspective of dominance, individual dispersedness, seemed to form new patterns of global movement. So she's talking about, I guess, this digital nomad phenomenon today, where we sort of seem to float around the world, unified by our relationship to technological networks that allow us to do so. Sterl continues, migration flows, capital flows, data flows, and so forth looked identical from this elevated point of view and produced a new magic geography. Seen from up there, migrants and displaced people seemed an ideal allegory of global mobility and alienation, appearing as incarnations of abstract difference. So, if you're interested in the Tower of Babel story, if you read the Ted Chiang novel, I also highly recommend Hito Sterl's essay here, and I'll be happy to share a copy with you. In conclusion to her essay, Hito Sterl offers a really interesting resolution to the paradox of the Tower of Babel. If by building the tower up to reach the level of the divine, or simply by building technology up to elevate ourselves beyond the human condition, and if this project is always doomed to fail or doomed to return us to where we started, Hito Sterl points to a kind of interesting solution posed by Franz Kafka in a very, very short story he wrote that's just a few sentences. Kafka writes, "What are you building? I want to dig a subterranean passage. Some progress must be made. My station up there is much too high. We are digging a pit of Babel." So rather than technology lifting us up, elevating us from the ground to the sky, Kafka reverses this and suggests that we dig down into the past, seeking not the superiority of the high position, but to understand what is beneath our feet. And so for Kafka, communication with the divine requires us to almost travel in the opposite direction and dig down through all of the structures that are those of the past, I guess, or to understand the world that is underneath our feet. It's an interesting sort of reversal, and I think architecturally it's an interesting symmetry where to build a tall building or to dig a large pit, we are sort of reversing a lot of the engineering problems, but formally we create things that are almost a perfect mirror image of one another. Okay, so that's sort of the end of my storytelling from the Tower of Babel mythological story through architecture and through Gothic horror and through science fiction. Now I want to bring it back to the idea of using space and rules to tell stories and to explore complex ideas. So for those of you who were in class last week, we played this game called The Quiet Year that has quite a nice simple set of rules, and we saw how through repetition these sets of rules could be used to build quite a complex spatial story about alien planets, struggling civilizations, dangerous landscapes, rival groups, mysterious holes in the earth, and so on. What I want to do this week in Blender is we're going to start to learn some basic 3D modeling, but we're going to combine this with the idea of building towers and cities, or building any type of procedural architecture that we might use to tell a story. We're going to look at how we can model a small 3D feature, and then how we can multiply and transform these features to make complex and interesting worlds of our own. And we'll also discuss how simple acts of spatial storytelling can be used in this procedural or computational way to start thinking about fascinating questions about our relationship with technology and our relationship with how we change the world around us. But okay, so that's the end of the lecture for this week, and I look forward to seeing you in class, seeing what you've made in Blender, and moving on to our next discussions and exercises. Okay, thanks very much. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.